Okay, greetings, gang. Hello, friends. We're back again. It's Chapo coming at you this Monday. Me, Matt, and Felix, as usual. But for today's episode, we are joined once again by the Chapo Foreign Affairs Desk. I refer to all-time returning guest champion Derek Davison and a friend of the show, Daniel Bessner, the host of the upcoming the upcoming podcast project, American Prestige, here to take us on a trip around the world. Derek, Daniel, hello.
Hey, guys.
Hello. Derek is just, he's stunting. The number of challenge coins that he's racked up with his guest appearances on this show, it's ridiculous. He's putting new.
I gotta get a free sub at some point or something, right?
At any podcast affiliated sandwich shop, please turn in your challenge coin for a free tuna melt.
Yeah, you can go to Mission Barbecue whenever you want and get the Building 7 ribs.
Nice.
Well, like I said, Derek and Daniel are, they're our foreign affairs correspondent, our own personal intelligence bureau, here to give us the presidential daily briefing about what is going on in the world today. Let's just dive into it today. Let's start in the nation of Iran. Our old nemesis, Iran. They're at it again because they're not only trying to weasel out of this nuclear deal that they so surreptitiously
totally
and underhandedly undermined and are seeking to weaken America by agreeing to the standards of the nuclear disarmament treaty that they signed with us back during Obama.
Yeah, it's fucked up. They're acting like we killed their national hero or something.
in another sovereign country for no apparent reason. It was a pretty good move on the geniuses behind U.S. foreign policy.
Well, you guys forget that according to Miley Cyrus, General Miley Cyrus, Trump would have been criminally negligent if he hadn't killed Soleimani.
Party in the USA.
Head of the
he would have been
Chiefs of
sued,
Staff.
and he would have had to go in front of Judge Judy.
I would so happily trade him to Iran.
Absolutely.
Not even to kill, just do whatever you want. I don't care.
Truss him up like a turkey and just airdrop him into the center of the city.
A Trump for Ahmadinejad trade. That would be a hell of a trade.
That would be kind of cool. Ahmadinejad is a fan of. I don't agree with everything he's done, obviously, but we're perfect. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Ahmadinejad would free NBA YoungBoy.
Oh, definitely.
He's like a fan of rap. Yeah.
That's true. That's true. He's become a much more open-minded guy, I think. Since his presidency.
It's the foresight of leadership.
It would be a problem. He would lock up approximately 20 million other people, but YoungBoy would be free.
And
pretty cool.
We might very well be on that list.
That's fine. If you go to prison long enough, it's just your life. And he would let us do a show there. Yeah. It's fine. Because it's not really a big deal. Unless you're a musician and you can't really make music.
I was referring to what Matt was talking about. We got head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Epic milkshake duck on this guy. One day he's saying, "Oh, Trump's a tyrant," and we were all going to resign before he did a coup. And then the next day you find out, General Meek Milley is saying that if we don't kill Soleimani, Trump could go to jail. I want to know how that works.
The consequences would never be the same if we don't assassinate Soleimani.
And even the coup stuff was just him imagining a scenario in his head of Trump doing something and being like, "Oh, if he does that, I'm going to quit, and then he'll be sorry."
It was ridiculous.
There's no substance to it. It was just him kind of inventing a thing to be mad about.
Well, I love that because all the people who take that as an opportunity to be afraid all the time are like, "Look at this! It proves that Trump would stop at nothing," and it's like. I'm pretty sure no one stopped at more things than Donald Trump.
That's all he does is he stops immediately.
Yeah, he's pretty much will go to no length to do anything.
I know we talked about it the last time, but as far as reasons to be afraid all the time, I'm not exactly reassured that the Joint Chiefs of Staff took this opportunity to remind everyone that if you want to do a coup, you're going to need the military. So you better make sure that
right. Like,
you stay friendly with us.
Checklist.
Yeah, get us on your side. I'm not even sure any of them would have the bravery to do it, though. They're such professionalized people at this point. There's no gumption that one would need to do a real coup.
Yeah, they're all just middle managers. It's a bunch of Michael Scotts.
Exactly. They all have PhDs, literally.
There's no gumption and there's no charisma. Like, there's no MacArthur who could come in and rally people.
MacArthur couldn't even do it. Like, that's the thing is, like, yeah, these guys are nothing. Like, they're nothing compared to like MacArthur or Patton. Even those guys like couldn't do it. Like, MacArthur was on the verge of it, kind of, or starting it, kind of, and then Richard Russell was like, "Let's make him cry in front of the Senate," and that ended it.
It's funny you bring up General MacArthur, because I found out just this past weekend. I found out another very interesting bit of Menaker family lore as it relates to General MacArthur, and that is that my great uncle Frederick Engels Menaker became friends on some sort of transatlantic ship crossing with the sort of famous muckraking the famous muckraking columnist Drew Pearson. Mm-hmm. And Drew Pearson was looking for dirt on General MacArthur when he wanted to run for president. And he apparently gave my great uncle the assignment, or he just asked him to hang out with and host General MacArthur's mistress at dinner, and just sort of take her about town to get the dirt on basically everything about their relationship. And that is ultimately one of the reasons he didn't run for president, is because Drew Pearson, and courtesy of my great uncle, had this Oppo file on a guy who maybe would have done a coup. Had he had the chance. That's
so interesting, because all those guys had mistresses. Eisenhower had a very famous one. I think her name was Kay, and it was kind of an open secret that he was sleeping with her throughout most of the European campaign, I believe.
We talked about that a few episodes ago, about how
Eisenhower he tried to resign to Marshall because he was in love with his Jeep driver, and he was get your shit together.
Yeah, Marshall was like, we're in World War II.
It's like, dude, you're plotting Operation Overlord. Maybe, fucking chill out.
Generals used to be awesome. Like, Petraeus' affair sucks so much compared to that.
Yeah, it's so lame compared to, your Jeep driver who's driving you all over England. It was like a CIA analyst, right, with Petraeus? It was someone he met in,
it was his biographer.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
It was his biographer, and she was stitched up because all of the other military hotwives of Tampa who sort of flock around CENTCOM were jealous that she had the sort of catbird seat of America's at the time #1 general.
Yeah, her name was Paula Broadband or something.
Yeah, something like that. No, that's close.
I think that's what it is. But back to the nation of Iran. Iran had an election. Who was just elected, and how does the election of what is his name, Ibrahim Raisi?
Yeah.
How does that play into the context of these stalled nuclear talks, and also a prisoner exchange that was supposed to go forward?
So Ebrahim Raisi, who was the chief justice in Iran previously, ran for president, which was somewhat surprising in that chief justice is actually probably a better job than Iranian president. But he's clearly being groomed or it seems like he's being groomed to succeed Ali Khamenei as supreme leader. And so he ran for president, in a pretty stark contrast to the way Iran usually manages its elections, where they sort of put out guardrails for candidates, and they exclude anybody who goes outside the guardrails. This time, the Guardian Council, which is responsible for vetting candidates, really cut anybody who could have been a challenger to Raisi. So it was much more of a staged, kind of managed process. This time around, Raisi won with 72% of the vote, with fairly low turnout, sub 50%, which for an Iranian presidential election is quite low. Raisi is a bad dude. Really, he's implicated in back in the 1980s. He was the deputy prosecutor in Tehran and was implicated in a sweeping, a mass arrest and then mass execution of a lot of political prisoners. So he's got a record that is not terribly good. But the salient thing in terms of the nuclear talks is that just the transition itself, the fact that Iran is, in the middle now of a presidential transition. They're going from a reasonably moderate president, at least on the subject of foreign affairs and engagement with the U.S., to one who is going to be quite a bit more hardline. And he's sort of put the kibosh on any further negotiations on the nuclear deal until he takes office and is able to oversee it himself. So it's not an end to those talks, but it is an unfortunate pause at a time when it looked like things were progressing in a positive direction. And it's a function, frankly, to some degree of the fact that the Biden administration, after coming in saying we're going to reverse what Trump did, we're going to get back into the nuclear deal, spent a good 2+ months kind of dicking around and saying, well, Iran has to come back into compliance first and then we'll talk about it. And that was, obviously a non-starter for the Iranians. And it was just a lot of wasted time that now puts everything in the middle of this presidential transition.
Typical Biden bullshit of maintaining hegemony and pretending that you're going to be doing something different, which I think has been really characteristic of this administration and makes total sense given who he's appointed to these top positions, particularly Anthony Blinken. I think this is just classic Biden foreign policy.
So they had a couple of months before this presidential election that they possibly could have, if they hadn't had put all these preconditions or just dicked around, possibly got the nuclear agreement reinstated. But now there seems with this more hardline administration, there's way less of a possibility of that ever happening.
I still think that the nuclear deal is going to be reinstated because it's obviously in Iran's interest to see it reinstated and get sanctions relief. I mean, they're desperate for that. What the Biden administration was hoping for was that reinstating the nuclear deal would be a stepping stone to further diplomacy, and I don't think that's going to happen under Raisi. He seems to be interested in regional diplomacy, like with the Saudis, for example, but he has no interest in talking to the Americans, which may not be the worst thing in the world, actually. Talking to the Americans doesn't work out very well for the Iranians. A regional approach might be a better way to go. In terms of the prisoner swap, this was a negotiation that was apparently going on in Geneva, kind of alongside the nuclear talks. And supposedly, according to the Iranians, they had agreed with the U.S. and the U.K. on kind of an exchange of prisoners. And the Biden administration, after the Iranians said we'd like to put a hold on the nuclear talks and come back to it after the transition, the Biden administration put the kibosh on the prisoner exchange. Supposedly the UK was, is still gung-ho to go forward with it, but Biden has said, no, we're not going to do this until there's progress on the nuclear talks. The Biden administration has denied this, and it's hard to know exactly who's talking out of their ass here, but that's become another point of contention in a situation where you would like to see fewer points of contention at this point, not more.
Do we know anything about these prisoners that were going to be exchanged, theoretically?
I mean, Iran has a number of dual nationals, U.S. and U.K. Iranian, kind of dual nationals who are in prison for one reason or another. And I don't know the specifics as to who they would be releasing, but you hear, there's names, Niamazi is one. There are a couple of UK citizens who could, potentially be released. But I don't know specifically. On the other side, it's probably people who are have been arrested for sanctions violations and that sort of thing, who the Iranians would be after.
This is also happening in the context of, various ongoing proxy wars in the region between America and its allies and clients, and Iran and theirs, particularly in Syria and Yemen. I mean, there's been continuing American airstrikes on militias in Syria. Are these militias linked to Iran?
They are. I mean, they get support from Iran. There's a tendency... and this is true of the Houthis in Yemen as well. There's a tendency on the part of policymakers in Washington to view these groups as kind of just down the line puppets of Iran. They do the same thing with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is not true. I mean, they get support and some guidance, maybe some financial and material support from Iran, but they're not quite as tied at the hip as I think is the Washington consensus.
And just like in terms of like just the Yemen conflict and Saudi Arabia, I mean this is just still ongoing. I mean I'm seeing more of a media push in America to talk about how ruthless and evil the Houthis are and all the war crimes they're doing. I mean, like how does one interpret? I mean, this kind of this PR effort on behalf of the Saudis and their allies.
Yeah, so I mean, the Biden administration announced, Joe Biden announced in his first foreign policy speech back in, I think it was early February, that he was going to end U.S. support for offensive Saudi operations in Yemen. There's no evidence that he's changed U.S. policy in Yemen in any way. I mean, we're still maintaining Saudi aircraft. I don't see any
I believe
change.
We're doing it through contractors now.
Yeah,
just
right.
the U.S. Air Force isn't doing it directly.
Right, which we'll be seeing more of.
U.S. contractor, yeah.
I mean, that's going to be a bigger and bigger thing. I think Danny's right.
And just to very quickly, I think that we're going to see in general not only use of more contractors, but this shift, particularly in the Middle East, to proxy wars, like Will was saying, but also a lot more aerial surveillance and aerial strikes as the U.S. I think does do a managed kind of retreat from the region. I think what we're seeing now in Yemen is going to be representative of a broader shift in U.S. strategy. I don't know if you think that's right, Derek, or not.
I do. I think that, I mean, the next, I don't know if we can talk about the Afghanistan withdrawal, but Iraq is the next domino to go. And I think there's a lot more consternation about that withdrawal, but it kind of needs to happen politically from the Iraqi perspective. And the U.S. is going to want to find a way to keep managing Iran, containing Iran in that region. And it'll have to be kind of drones and airstrikes.
Yeah, kind of what like political scientists call offshore balancing in a sense, where the U.S. is still going to try to basically manipulate the entire region, but without doing kind of any boots on the ground. And I think that's going to be this shift to long-term imperial management that kind of echoes what, Rome did 2,000 years ago-ish, and is the classic move of declining empires that have lost political legitimacy. And I think this is going to be the big story of the first Biden term.
Yeah, I mean, the official American policy since sort of the mid to late 90s onwards, and almost everything is put it in a place or do it in such a way that no one thinks about it. The issue with Yemen on the American end wasn't, that this was a mismanaged war, that the Saudis sort of on behalf of the UAE bit off more than they could chew. It was that for the first time people were actually thinking about it and actually thinking about American engagement with Saudi policy. If we can do it in such a way where it's sort of a franchise system, problem solved.
Exactly. Basically, the U.S. military
in between. Right.
Yeah, the U.S. military serves as kind of the minor leagues for future contractors. I think you're going to see that sort of structure develop, kind of like a Janissary Corps over time.
The Yemen situation now is, the Biden administration has tried to get peace talks going again. There have been a few moves in that direction, but they're really stalled over the Houthis have kind of insisted that they want to see an end to the blockade that the Saudis have imposed before they will engage in talks on a ceasefire. And what I think the Saudis and the administration, the Biden administration, want is an exchange. We'll lift the blockade in exchange for a ceasefire, which is gumming things up. The conflict is heated up. It's been pretty intense in Ma'rib province, which is sort of in north central Yemen. It's the last major population center in northern Yemen. The Houthis have been really engaged in trying to capture Ma'rib city and the oil fields that surround it as sort of the last piece of the puzzle before they go to the negotiating table with as much leverage as possible. The Saudis and the Yemeni government have started a counteroffensive in another province a little further south called Bayda, which I haven't seen, and full disclosure, I've been on vacation for a few days, so I'm not entirely on top of things. But at last check, they were making some pretty good advances, and I'm not sure that could kind of redefine where the situation is on the ground.
Wow, big letdown from Derek here. He took his eye off the Yemen situation for 2 days so he could be with his family.
We launch a podcast and Derek immediately goes on vacation. Classic move.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're going to return again to the Afghanistan withdrawal in our reading series for this week, but I just want to just like briefly just talk about. I mean, do you guys see like in because obviously like as this becomes real and as the Taliban takes back more of the country, I'm seeing a lot of like pressure from the media on Biden himself and his surrogates to be like, well, what happens when the Taliban takes over the country? Like, will you be responsible for like all the people that die? Like, or is America responsible for the people who will die after we pull out? And Biden said candidly, no, we're not. But I mean, obviously, yes, we are, but we're responsible for like every other death that's happened up until this point. So It doesn't really seem like, in for a penny, in for a pound.
Well, that is the thing. Like, none of this works on Biden. He is unmoved by like the emotional manipulation that the press does on Afghanistan.
I'm not going to answer any more question on Afghanistan. Look, it's 4th of July. I'm concerned that you guys are asking me questions that I'll answer next week, but this is a holiday weekend. I'm going to celebrate it. There's great things happening.
There was someone posted a excerpt from a book about Richard Holbrooke, where some like shitty journalist like sits down with Biden and he's like, if we leave Afghanistan, what about women's rights? And Biden goes, come on, man, I'm not sending my son over there for that. I'm not sending my son back for women's rights. Who cares? And it is like kind of a heartless answer, but at the same time, it is like, you're not going to move Americans on that. B, I mean, we've been there for 20 years, and if it's exactly the same, then we're not going to make it any better. We haven't.
It's such a wacky
They've been
argument.
saying this from the fucking beginning. There have been 20 years of girls going to school. Have they graduated? Have they gotten jobs? Is the place any fucking different? No. It's like you do come to this grim realization where it's like, well, this is something that only they can figure out. We've been there for 20 fucking years. If we're not any closer, I don't know what to fucking tell you. But I mean, the purpose of this is like it's not to move Americans, it's to move policymakers. And luckily that specifically doesn't move Biden.
Because he's not a meritocrat. And I think that Biden just wasn't trained in the sort of imperial management that the people who essentially came after him were trained in. And this was like the logic of particularly of the 1990s, when the U.S. empire needs this new logic without the Soviet Union. It's like, we're going to save the world. And that, of course, leads into Afghanistan and it leads into Iraq. But Biden is just from a different generation. So it just doesn't make sense for him. And it's just also it's this literally liberal fucking imperialism from the 19th century, the civilizing mission. It's the exact same language that the British were using, that the French were using. It is a defining characteristic of liberal imperialism, which I think historically has done so much damage to the world. It's not even a question any longer to basically make these claims. And of course, George W. Bush said that he felt bad for Afghan women or something along those lines in an interview last week. And it's just so absurd. If George W. Bush, anyone has done as much damage to women in the world more than George W. Bush, it's almost difficult to fathom. So I wonder if that sort of argument is going to begin to lose its steam, but I think that'll just be replaced with something of like, America needs to dominate the world.
Yeah, no, it'll be, they'll find a new thing. This thing never goes away. It always like shifts to whatever the meta is. And the meta for a while, it was, Samantha Power type shit. It's like, like you said, for the 90s up until like now, kind of, it's Cecil Rhodes who goes to Sweet Green.
Right,
but
exactly.
After that, it will be something else. It'll be like, maybe they'll pivot to the right, and it's like, don't you want to be a crusader? Don't you want to be based and like go to war and come back and take a wife?
Well, they've started to do that. Yeah, with the rehabilitation of burn out neocons into the Democratic sphere now, the people who kind of washed out with Trump. There is a lot of talk, or there has been more talk about just kind of frankly saying we need to be in Afghanistan forever because it's the frontier of the empire.
The Indian War.
And we have to police
Indian
it.
Wars.
But just, I do want to say, like, the fucking gall of George W. Bush to say that, it's an oversimplification to say that Bush and his hard-on for Iraq caused the United States to drop the ball on Afghanistan and shift all of its resources to this other completely fucking moronic conflict. But it did contribute to the fact that this 20-year conflict has gotten nowhere. You had a situation where the Taliban was beaten. The United States had achieved its war aims in Afghanistan, except for this lingering, taking apart the leadership of Al-Qaeda. And it was at that point that this fucking numbnuts said, we have to go into Iraq now. We have to go after Saddam Hussein for reasons that, are entirely, were entirely bullshit at the time and remain, have been even, revealed to be even more bullshit since then. But for him to now turn around and say, well, I feel bad for Afghan women. I mean, what the fuck? He's the guy who started this shit show to begin with.
But it seems that embrace, like the neocons are returning home to the Democratic Party. And I think Felix is right. And Derek, as you were saying, it's already begun that's going to be the move. The move is just going to be a move towards almost a pure power political situation. And I think most Americans just aren't going to care.
They're their only move. I mean, I do see a lot of talk in like sort of the persuasion sphere, the right center to like stated left center of like, young men are adrift. Young men need meaning, but they're getting wrapped up in all this shit. And I think like the solution of that will be like, no, take your birthright, like become a man by killing someone. And that is very interesting because if you look at the Saudi foreign policy, where they never really had like a formalized, they never really had formalized like illegals programs or like intelligence cells in other countries, but more or less just took their population of scary young men and were like, here, go to Chechnya, here, go to Afghanistan, go here, spread the word. You become your client states if you do this long enough. And I don't really think that will work the same way. I think we're too far gone for that. I think that, if your message to young men is, you're adrift, to claim your birthright, whatever, they're like, I already am. I'm posting.
Right.
You're not going to get them to do this. You're not going to get them into this fucking dead end. No one gives a shit. You burnt out America on this for the better, probably.
The most hope, honestly, like your best bet is, hey, do you want to be well trained for the coming race wars in America?
Yeah.
Go out and get some kills, get some notches on your gun, and then come home. Because everybody who wants to fight, they identify their enemy as within. The moment, the time when you could imagine it as some scary other is over after Iraq crapped out. Everyone now sees the enemy as internal.
But that's the amazing thing is, that since the mid 90s, since the destruction of like the American like public housing high rise, since people thought like it was too scary to have something like Robert Taylor Homes or Cabrini Green sort of in the middle of the city. And it's like, okay, what's the solution? We're going to bring them down. And everything fled into these lesser populated places that used to be like good middle class neighborhoods when there were good middle class jobs. It's like, why for like this is for a different group than like, socially dislocated white men. But like for people who live in like Englewood, someone who lives in like O Block or somewhere in Jacksonville or Memphis, it's like, I live in Syria. I live in Afghanistan. Like the war is fucking here. You're going to get me to sign up to go to another war? I live in fucking Homs. That's what so many American neighborhoods are already.
And I also think you're going to see that shift to robot soldiers as well. So there's going to be a real, I think, connection between gaming and military shit. And the military itself is already starting to get this going with things like esports teams, and there's new developments in AI. It's like that old Simpsons joke, robot warriors will be fighting in the future. I think we're going to start seeing that in the next 10 years, maybe earlier.
The wars of the future will not be fought on a battlefield or at sea. They will be fought in space, or possibly on top of a very tall mountain. In either case, most of the actual fighting will be done by small robots. And as you go forth today, remember always, your duty is clear: to build and maintain those robots.
Just like the broader point about the Afghan withdrawal, or like the seeming like this finally like we're leaving that country, and with it you see the concurrent like news stories about what about our translators? What about all the people that are going to die? What about all this footage of like the Taliban recovering like tons of American weapons and infrastructure? Oh, like how do you feel about that? And I think, it's heartening in one way to see that basically nobody, the president included, gives a shit. But like you can't draw too much the hope out of that, because I just think like the American public overall just doesn't care about anything that happens overseas. And to the extent that it doesn't trouble them, they'll countenance any level of horror, us directly engaging in it or otherwise.
No, yeah, that is the way that, like, the people now who are trying emotional manipulation, the thing that allowed them to do it for so long, the thing that allowed them to run this gangster state internationally so long, was the fact that Americans genuinely do not like thinking about this. The thing that's preventing us, to quote the Thomas challenge, from getting back out there is, that we don't like thinking about this at all. You can't emotionally manipulate someone who's already doesn't care.
And I just want to underline that that's really by design. When the American empire was being created in the 40s, the people who did it were like, we're not going to give ordinary Americans any say over imperial management. And so basically the entire national security state is by design made to remove not only ordinary people, which like we barely get anything in the system anyway, but even Congress. If you think about things that should properly be the function of a state, like, I don't know, researching what a state should do, that's privatized in this country to think tanks. And now that's just expanded to be privatized to the literal fighting of wars. And we basically have mercenaries. It's like Gustavus Adolphus traipsing across Europe. We have a mercenary army effectively. And so Americans, of course, they don't give a shit because they have no fucking say about what their country does in the world.
This is in terms of like the reality of the prospects of the Taliban once again taking over control of all of Afghanistan. I mean, Derek, you mentioned earlier that, like before the show, you mentioned earlier that Biden, like that they're seeking to maybe offset that in some way by building a new military base in Central Asia, or like it would involve some deal with Russia in order for that to be the case. I mean, like, how does that factor in?
Yeah, the Russia thing is something I've just seen in the last couple of days, but the idea, is sort of the deal for the U.S. to withdraw is contingent on the Taliban meeting certain, basically unenforceable conditions. One of which is separating itself from Al Qaeda and sort of making sure that Afghanistan is never again used as a hideout for international terrorism. So the point, what they've been talking about is kind of how can we do some kind of a facility? How can we put some kind of a facility around Afghanistan in the vicinity, preferably in a Central Asian country, one of the old Soviet republics, to monitor that, and if necessary, to do a drone strike on like an Al Qaeda group or an Islamic State group or whatever, if we see something going on. And potentially, and you've seen people kind of slip, especially senior military officers kind of slip and suggested that this base could also be used to attack the Taliban if there was some kind of catastrophic event, like the fall of Saigon, basically, the fall of Kabul. But yeah, it's been, none of the Central Asian republics have been seemingly very amenable to this. They're all kind of trying to make peace with the idea of the Taliban taking over again, and not antagonizing and causing a rift with them. They're also all of them, are still somewhat beholden to Russia in some way, or at least need to take, Russian concerns into account about hosting the American military. And so there's been, over the last few days, I've seen floated the idea of the U.S. kind of leasing or borrowing military facilities from Russia in Central Asia, but that would come with, a lot of conditions, like intelligence sharing with the Russians, and their concerns about like putting U.S. drones at a Russian base and like having Russian personnel looking at these things.
We can lease their military bases, but we have to allow their bots on our social media.
So I don't think that's going to go anywhere, but this is still something that's talked about in terms of kind of maintaining some kind of a presence in the region, even after the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Which just highlights the psychopathy of this whole approach. What is the United States doing in this region? What fucking way is our American interests connected to just being permanently dominant in basically Southwest Asia forever? I mean, this is it's a pathology. It makes absolutely no sense, especially given what's going on at home. And so you just see this like deep throbbing psychosis at the core of the entirety of U.S. foreign policy across parties. It's really fucking grim shit.
I see where you're coming from with that, but, maybe if we have more of a working relationship with these Russians, hardworking Americans who maybe own a business, who maybe are living, they have the space, they'll finally be able to buy the Sable that they want.
Not referring to anyone specifically, just someone, yeah.
Some
random American.
Business owner, not like you would see him on the street and go, that's a handsome guy, but you wouldn't immediately pick him for a business owner. You'd be like, oh, he's a bit over 6 feet. He's very confident. That's a guy who animals respect him. Everyone knows that. If he got 2 Sables, a brother and a sister, he'd have no problems. He doesn't have wallpaper, so they can't fuck that up.
There you go.
And he should be able to own 2 Sables because he loves them.
The one other thing about Afghanistan that's sort of kind of in concert with what we talked about earlier in the show, the rise of more proxy conflicts and less direct U.S. involvement. One of the lingering issues is with the withdrawal. It has been the security of Kabul airport, which there probably needs to be some independent security force stationed there, or else a lot of countries, maybe the U.S. included, are going to pack up their embassies in Kabul and get the hell out of there because they don't have any confidence that the Afghan government can hold on to the city. So we've been talking to Turkey about putting, again, kind of leaving a residual force at the airport just to secure the airport as a proxy, basically, for the United States. The Turks have said they would be willing to do that with U.S. support. The Taliban has said, hell no, Turkey needs to get out along with the rest of NATO. And so that's very much up in the air. Like the Turks are supposedly going to be in negotiations with the Taliban directly to kind of hash this out if they can. But I don't know. That seems like a dead end to me.
It's very similar to the whole end of Vietnam thing with the decent interval strategy. I mean, I don't know, Derek, if you agree, but that's kind of what I view this like. Everyone kind of knows in 10 years it's probably going to be dominated by the Taliban, but it's just the idea of like American prestige needs to be protected for a certain number of years, ideally. I really think that's what's going on here.
So they're just trying to like delay the inevitable, which is a Saigon type scenario.
Right, Kissinger, same thing. Yeah, exactly. That's what I think it is.
Yeah, I think there's a desire to sort of put some distance between our withdrawal and the fall of Kabul. There's also this sort of Hail Mary idea that with the U.S. gone, the other countries in the region, Russia, Iran, India, Pakistan, will all of whom, for one reason or another, have some reason not to want the Taliban to take over in Afghanistan, or worse, to have Afghanistan kind of fall into perpetual civil war again. So there's this kind of Hail Mary hope that these other countries, China also would be included in this, would step in and take over some responsibility for this themselves. And that's that's a shot in the dark, I think.
Yeah,
but
good luck.
It can't possibly be any worse than what the United States has done. So we'll see.
Well, to move away from Central Asia over to this hemisphere. I want to talk about Haiti. We don't need to talk too long because it's very hard to figure out exactly what's going on, because it's very hard to get like reliable information. But in the now week or 2 weeks since the assassination of the Haitian president Jovenel Moïse by what appear to be Colombian mercenaries hired by some shady fucking doctor in Florida. Haiti's in like a political crisis right now because it's like who exactly is in charge of that company? But like in the time that's passed since, has there been any development in terms of just at the very least just speculating on who is really behind this assassination and what their goal is? And also, could you talk about the prospects for perhaps a U.S. intervention? Because I'm seeing more and more calls that the U.S. needs to intervene in Haiti because of the ongoing political crisis in terms of like who is running the country. I mean, the answer is, I don't know, like that people want it to be the United States or the UN Blue Helmets or something like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the U.S. intervention in Haiti's worked out so well every other time we've done it.
Yeah, we got a long history.
It's always a good deal, especially for the Haitians. The possibility of an intervention, I think, is a direct intervention has shrunk a little bit. I think, first of all, Biden, said that he's not planning to intervene in that way. He's not going to send the U.S. military in. Secondly, the political crisis is starting. It looks like it may be starting to resolve itself a little bit. There was a dispute between the interim prime minister, Claude Joseph, who sort of assumed power after Moïse was assassinated, even though he was, within days of being kind of on his way out of that job. Moïse had appointed a new prime minister, Ariel, I guess Henri, I don't know. My French is not good, so excuse me. But there was there was a sort of contest between these two guys, who was the legitimate prime minister and who could legitimately form a government. Joseph announced, I think just today, actually, that he's going to step down and make way for Ariel Henry. So that part of it seems to be resolving itself. There's no longer two claimants to the premiership. There's only one. That doesn't resolve the issue of who should be the interim president, and that's really a legal constitutional question that can't be resolved, basically, because Haiti doesn't have a functioning parliament, and the chief justice of their Supreme Court, who was under at least one interpretation of the law, was next in line to be president, died, I think, last month of COVID, so he's not an option. So they were really in kind of an empty space here, and there's should be an election later this year for both parliament and the president. So that could resolve things if it happens at this point. Who knows? In terms of the assassins, these Colombians, it's still very murky. There's been speculation about some element of this being an inside job, or that the Colombians claiming that they were hired to actually provide security for Moïse, and that there was, his own kind of Haitian security was involved in the assassination or something like that. There's a lot of these kind of conspiracy theories running around. The one that I've seen that makes the most sense to me is that Moïse was kind of, sacrificed in a sense by the kind of conservative elements in Haitian politics, who had kind of worn out their patience with him in the extended kind of years-long political crisis, or the couple of years at least, that he's overseen, and kind of were worried that he was going to lose control to some really unacceptable faction, leftists, or God forbid, the people of Haiti, and so they bumped him off to kind of gain some control of the situation, and maybe to actually try to spark a U.S. intervention, to try and get Washington to do something to step in and put its foot down. But that's all speculative as far as I know.
But the U.S. did that, 25 years ago, 27 years ago. So it's not totally crazy. And I just wanted to highlight that again. Yeah, we see from the Middle East to Haiti, right, that the importance of these mercenaries. We see a change in sort of the structure of warfare that the United States has supported for the last 30 years. I mean, these guys must in some way be connected to Plan Colombia. There's just no way that they're not in any meaningful way. And so we see, again, the blowback, the coming home to roost of what happens when the United States supports these international mercenary groups around the world, essentially creates them. And you'll see stuff like this more and more as field armies go back.
Well, I mean, just real quick. I mean, like the once deposed president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, just returned to Haiti just yesterday he was in Cuba for like a month for, I think, seeking like unspecified medical treatment, but he was greeted by hundreds at the airport. But yeah, like, I mean, he was the guy that we, shuffled out of there in the early 90s. But I mean, like, do you have? I mean, does that complicate matters? I mean, does Aristide still have a popular constituency in Haiti?
I mean, it's interesting timing. I don't know enough about Haitian politics to say how much support he has, but it was certainly interesting timing for him to come back just now. Whether the U.S. would allow that, because as you say, we've had we already took him out once. That's another question entirely. But he could. I mean, he could be a player here. Certainly, in if not as an actual contender for the presidency or for power, as somebody kind of working behind the scenes.
Yeah, a lot of I've heard experts on Haiti refer to the gangsterization of the company and of the country. So I think that's also an interesting way to look at it. That there are these different power centers, like not like the five families fighting, right? And you could have a charismatic leader come back and assume control of one of the various gangster groups, and that could have some potential effect. But I think, like Derek says, it's really in process right now.
Well, moving on from Haiti to the country that Aristide was seeking medical treatment in, just finally, and we talked about this a lot lately, but Cuba. Obviously protests are ongoing. Protests and counter protests are ongoing in Cuba, and anytime Cuba is in the news, particularly if there is an upswell in anti-government sentiment among people on the island, it's always going to be leading in the news because of how powerful the Florida Cuban community is in shaping American policy and just how we think about Cuba and that country and that part of the world. I mean, there's sort of there was a planned sort of like a bay of influencers where people like wanting the U.S. government to give them the right to arm themselves and to form a sort of flotilla of boats.
Right, they're going to sail their yachts into
Cuba, which is a plan I'm 100% in favor of. I would really like to see that go forward. But I mean, I bring up Cuba again just in one very specific sense. I mean, we've talked a lot about the protests that are going on there and the history of America and basically keeping that country in our crosshairs for about 70 years now. But I mean, specifically, I wanted to ask you guys because there was one specific thing. I think we referenced it a little bit on the last show. But this is the influence of the discipline of political science on our understanding of these issues. Because I mean, there was this tweet that was going around where it was like a political scientist who was using graphs to make the case that Cuba is, she using the power of graphs. She was able to show a huge drop off in the freedom index when Batista was overthrown by Castro in 1959. So I was just wondering, I mean, the discipline of the political science in general. I mean, it was so hilarious, and it was such a perfect encapsulation of it to be like, well, if you look at this graph here, you'll see that the antebellum South was actually a freer country than Haiti under communist rule. But it just, I mean, this is a hokum discipline, right?
I mean,
no offense to anyone who studied it, but
these numbers are like hot or not for geopolitics. Basically, it's like your democracy is a 2, but my democracy is a 10. It's hot as shit.
It's a smoke show. It's a 10 out of 10.
Yeah, it's like
show.
A smoke show. It's the hottest democracy going, and you assign these numbers based on arbitrary characteristics of what you think a democracy should look like, which is basically what does the United States do, or whatever model, Western model you have of what democracy is supposed to be. You subjectively then kind of group these things and give it a number, and then put it on a graph, so you somehow kind of transmogrify it into an objective statistic,
right?
And then you can start to compare things, and and treat it like it's a fact instead of just a fucking arbitrary opinion.
Yeah, and as someone who unfortunately has devoted their life to studying the history of political science in some sense, it's really a discipline that arose during and after World War II, totally in concert with the American Empire. And I think it's really important to recognize that things like area studies were funded by the U.S. government, partially to create a cadre of experts able to manage the American imperial apparatus. And so you get the creation of a literal discipline in the United States' most elite universities that is specifically designed to foster American empire and American hegemony. And things like the Freedom Index and things that are promoted by places like Freedom House, I just think are epistemologically, that is, in terms of the knowledge that they represent, are really ridiculous. They're trying to quantify and they're trying to model a social reality that is ultimately unmodelable. That search for perfect knowledge, which is so characteristic of the post-World War II American state and American society and American universities, I think is just fundamentally misguided. You're not going to be able to abstract social reality into numbers in a way that will either give you accurate predictions or an understanding of what's going on the ground, because the ultimate normative thing that all these things are being measured against is the United States. And it's not only the United States, it's a particular class of American elites and what they understand the United States to be. So in some sense, I just think from a fundamental perspective, the project is totally misguided. And it gets even more misguided when you try to quantify things like freedom or happiness.
Yeah.
It's just total bullshit. It's just total bullshit, in my opinion.
But just in terms of that, like the Freedom Index thing, right? Like, because it's just like, well, by the standards of the U.S. Constitution, you could point to Cuba and say, look, Cubans have less, political rights or freedoms in terms of like joining political parties or having a free press than America, or let's say some of our allies in the Western Hemisphere, like Colombia or Honduras or whatever. But like, when obscuring a social reality, it's like sort of like, well, which country would you rather live in as like an average person?
And what is freedom?
What is more free? Like, what is more freeing in your life? Like the right to join whatever political party you want, or the right to not be not be killed by a death squad.
Well, the idea that democracy can only be multi-party voting is absurd anyway. And that's why Cuba really is such a good litmus test for like just how much if you consider yourself a leftist, like how much you've really thought about what it would mean to transcend capitalism. Is that the idea? No, it would basically be just the same, and you'd have all these different parties voting. Well, no, you would absolutely not, because these things only exist in the context of capitalism.
And one of the things that's happened in the U.S., particularly among people who like discuss what freedom means, is that since the 30s, freedom has been explicitly defined as political freedom, as opposed to economic freedom or social freedom or cultural freedom. And that really is part and parcel of the project, I think, to remove ordinary people from any form of decision making in the United States. When you define freedom as essentially the right to vote, that's actually a very weak understanding of democracy. And everyone, remembers the 2 fingers of Iraq and the voting in 2006. Was that freedom? It's completely ridiculous. And so you have this normative perspective that is never talked about when people like quantify these ridiculous metrics.
That's why everybody is now hyper conspiracy theory oriented, is because we're told every day that we're free and that we get to vote and that vote is validating our choices. And yet everything that happens is against our will, what we don't want, makes our lives worse. How is that to be explained? And there is no effort to square that. And so, of course, people are going to figure, well, there have to be people behind the scenes. And it's like, yeah, they are doing things behind the scenes. And one of the ways they're doing that is by promoting an idea of freedom that involves this ritualized participation in democracy that does not touch any of the actual meaningful questions of economic freedom and the destiny, literally, of the fucking people. Like, what's going to happen to the industrial base? What's going to happen to the culture in every way. Those decisions are not made at the ballot box, but we're supposed to allow the vote to stand in for a validation of it, even though there is no mechanism to enforce our will.
I think that's right. And one of the other things that bugs me about these things like the Freedom Index is they're done in a vacuum. I mean, they're done without any context of the particular country's experience, and they're presented, if you're rated unfree or whatever, or partly unfree or whatever the ratings are, it's all characterized as sort of a failure of that country or a defect of that country. We don't talk about the 62-year embargo that the United States has levied on Cuba and what kind of impact that has on the politics of a country. We don't talk about sanctions on Iran and what kind of impact those have on the politics of a country that engender or create these situations that we then define as a lack of freedom or contribute to that. It's really, they're just empty measures.
I mean, I want to return to this idea about what in an American context, like we consider like what's a free country versus like a tyrannical authoritarian one. And a good example, because you can see it, is our protests against the ruling regime violently and brutally suppressed by the police and military forces that run that country. And in Cuba, there's been a lot of protest against the government and for the government. I'm sure, it's hard to tell, but I have not seen any of what I would consider credible media reports from credible journalists, American or, in the Spanish-speaking world, that would suggest that these protests in Cuba are being ruthlessly and violently suppressed by the Cuban state. I'm sure it's not all kid gloves. I don't want to make it seem like it's all, just everything's fine and nice down there. But let's contrast that with just the events of not even a couple weeks ago in Colombia, where there had been a massive protest movement in that country, mostly led by young people against their rather right-wing government, of which we know from the Colombian journalists, and because, they have a nominally free press in that country, we're able to know about things like this, that was suppressed by the Colombian police and military in a number of ghastly and unspeakable ways, including rape, torture, and murder of, we don't need possibly hundreds, if not thousands of civilians. And and again, Colombia, but corresponding with that, with this horrible violent crackdown on peaceful protests in Colombia, we didn't see the sort of the outpouring of people of American Colombian Americans saying oh, my country, it yearns for freedom, please America, intervene.
Yeah, Will, I think what you're getting at is really important, because what you're pointing to is that there's this element of liberalism that really fixates on the idea of a free press. And I think, whether a capitalist press can ever be truly free is really important. But I think it's based on the idea that a type of rational exchange is the key to political development. And so it's so foundational to how people understand politics, they don't even appreciate that that's what they're doing. They're like Jürgen Habermas claiming that, if information is free, then political progress will happen. And I just think that's historically and empirically untrue, but it's hard to, it's like a religious belief. It's hard to persuade people that that's not actually how things work. And so then they fixate on it and they lose sight of what I would say is more important things, like what you're referring to, which is brutal crackdowns on actual protesters, the violence of the state, a conservative state that does so much to disenfranchise its people.
I don't even know that you need to go to Colombia for this. I mean, just look at, I would be fascinated to do a poll and find out how many people in the United States who have been tweeting support for the protesters in Cuba think that it should be legal to run over Black Lives Matter protesters because you're late for your latte at Starbucks, or they're blocking your path to the Dunkin' Donuts or whatever.
Yeah,
it's a huge disconnect.
That's a very good point, Derek, because just over this last weekend, we also had video of an LAPD officer firing at point blank range a beanbag shotgun shell directly into the chest of a woman standing directly in front of her, unarmed, with her hands in the air, saying, "Don't shoot." over some insane anti-trans QAnon protest at a fucking Korean spa in LA. And by the way, the woman who got shot was there to counter protest these fucking fucking QAnon degenerates who were out there trying to check people's fucking genitals or just do whatever it is they do. But the cops just shot that woman in broad daylight in front of every TV camera. We all saw it. It hasn't been censored in our free press. But they just shot her directly in the chest with a less than lethal beanbag round from a shotgun. And again, so for Jen Psaki to come out there and then urge the Cuban government to, use restraint and not to violently suppress protests in their country is pretty fucking rich.
Yeah, and I mean, you can go around other protests that have happened, relatively recently in Latin America. You can look at the protests in Chile, a few months ago over the, calls to change the constitution, and the number of people who were blinded by cops firing rubber bullets at their heads in that protest movement was ridiculous. You can look at all the people who were killed after the right-wing junta took power in Bolivia, without hearing, a solitary word from Washington about the need for control or protecting the right to protest or exercising any restraint. It's sort of obvious what direction this rhetoric flows. It's only one direction.
We know pointing out the hypocrisy of the U.S. state is a fool's errand, but it's right there in front of everyone. It is juicy and unmistakable to miss. I mean, it's staring you right in the face. But
particularly after Trump, right? I mean, these are the people who spent 4 years disclaiming against Trump too. I think that's what makes it not just. That's why it's worth pointing out, because it was just all hypocritical bullshit the entire time. And I think that's worth understanding and highlighting.
All right. Well, okay. Wrapping up our show for today, I have a reading series that I think is the perfect companion piece to everything we've talked about today. It comes courtesy of David Brooks, writing in the op-ed section of the New York Times, headline, "The American Identity Crisis." You boys ready?
I'm always ready for a little David. Yeah. Absolutely.
David Brooks begins. For most of the past century, human dignity had a friend, the United States of America. It's off to a good start. There is no greater friend of human dignity than the United States of America over the past century. We are a deeply flawed and error-prone nation like any other, but America helped defeat fascism and communism and helped set the context for European peace, Asian prosperity, and the spread of democracy.
We're error prone. We do oopsies, oopsie, 500,000 Iraqis are dead. Oopsie, Venezuela's in shambles. Oops.
Yeah, that is one of the most frustrating framings of American power, that it's anything bad that happens is oversight. It's a poor mistake. It's more insulting than just admitting that we did it on purpose.
And 100 years ago, the U.S. was occupying Haiti and the Philippines, just to point out, literally 100 years ago.
Then came Iraq and Afghanistan, the two big oopsies of the 21st century.
Yeah.
And so then came Iraq and Afghanistan, and America lost faith in itself and its global role. Like a pitcher who's been shelled and no longer has confidence in his own stuff. I mean, God, it's just... We got to develop a new pitch. We got to work on our changeup. We've lost some of that gas. How are we going to get out on that mound?
A pitcher who maybe said some uncomfortable but true things about New York when he took the 7 train.
Brooks continues. On the left, many now reject the idea that America can be or is a global champion of democracy, and they find phrases like the indispensable nation or the last best hope on earth ridiculous. On the right, the wall building caucus has given up on the idea that the rest of the world is even worth engaging. I mean, it used
Clowns to the left, me jokers to the right.
It used to be David Brooks could wear his "Ask Me About the Indispensable Nation" T-shirt around Washington, D.C. without gales of laughter from children following him around. But that's become more difficult as of late. Many people around the world have always resisted America's self-appointed role as democracy's champion. Most of the population of the world have resisted that. But they have also been rightly appalled when America sits back and allows genocide to engulf places like Rwanda or allows regimes to threaten the world order. I mean, again, just like how fucking blinkered a worldview do you have to write a sentence like that, where it's just like, oh, well, all the genocides we're doing over the world, that's not a problem. And for some reason, those people continue to resist America's global role as the indispensable nation. But, then Rwanda happens and everyone wants something from us.
Yeah, it's very 1990s. This is literally an argument from the late 1990s. And I think that just shows that everyone knows, but the total intellectual exhaustion of this way of viewing the world.
The Afghans are the latest to witness this reality. The American bungles in Afghanistan have been well documented.
Oopsies.
We've spent trillions of dollars and lost thousands of our people. No mention of the Afghan people, but the 2-decade strategy of taking the fight to the terrorists in Afghanistan and elsewhere has meant that global terrorism is no longer seen as a major concern in daily life. I mean, is that really the reason that people no longer really care about global terrorism as a concern in their daily life? I mean,
the fact that it never really was a major concern in daily life should
probably helps
enter into this. Yeah.
Over the past few years, a small force of American troops has helped prevent some of the worst people on Earth from taking over a nation of more than 38 million, with relatively few American casualties. Some of the
how about other people casualties? What do we care about those? David knows his audience. You have to admit.
Well, I just like he says that we prevented some of the worst people on Earth from taking over the country of Afghanistan. It's like, David, are you talking about your friends at the American Enterprise Institute or the Heritage Foundation? In 1999, no Afghan girls attended secondary school. Within 4 years, 6% were enrolled. And as of 2017, the figure has climbed to nearly 40%. But America, disillusioned with itself, is now withdrawing. This is the thing, are we withdrawing because we're just so disillusioned with ourselves, or is we withdrawing because we've been defeated? I mean, I don't think
we've been defeated.
We lost. This is the thing, this psychoanalysis of the American public, which Danny, as you pointed out, has from the get-go been completely cut off from having any say whatsoever in whether we go to war, stay in war, how we intervene in other countries. It's just, Brooks has to psychoanalyze us now because we're all just so alienated and disillusioned and we've lost our faith. It's like, no, we lost. We lost that war. We have no ability to project force or impose conditions on Afghanistan because we've been routed and we have to leave because we just can't do it anymore.
This reminds me of an article that you write about an athlete who's maybe been at their sport for too long. And it's like, oh, they need to fall in love with the game again. We just got caught out there.
Well, it's also like his implicit program is genuinely psychotic. It's hundreds of years of military occupation. Like him and Max Boot, I think Boot definitely has made a reference to the so-called Indian Wars. And that's essentially what Brooks is advocating, like a permanent frontier, genocidal, exterminatory campaign to create, Afghanistan in the image of the United States. And it's wild that sort of thing could still be in the mainstream. It's just so racist, so brutal. It's really bizarre.
But again, because we've outsourced so much of this, because there's no longer a draft. There's no longer even a sense that the military at large is involved here, as opposed to a small group within it. We're outsourcing even further to drones and robots basically over human beings. Because of that, and we don't even raise taxes to cover the costs of these things anymore. The person who reads David Brooks, the kind of person who eagerly picks up the New York Times is like, I want to. What did David have to say today? They feel none of this. They feel no impact from a perpetual occupation of Afghanistan. There's nothing that touches them from that. And so he can say stuff like this. He can talk about, we should just keep doing this forever. It hasn't mussed your hair so far. So why should you care? Let's keep doing it.
Jumping ahead, Brooks writes, history didn't stop just because America lost confidence in itself. As President Biden correctly notes, the world finds itself enmeshed in a vast contest between democracy and different forms of autocracy. This is not just a struggle between political systems. It's an economic, cultural, intellectual, and political contest all at once. A struggle between the forces of progressive modernity and reaction. I mean, is he talking about the rest of the world or just America itself? Because, I mean, like, that's a pretty accurate description of our domestic political climate. But, I mean, I'm not sure David Brooks is entirely on the side of the angels in that conflict. Over the past decades, America and its allies have betrayed our values and compromised with tyrants innumerable times. But at their core, the liberal powers radiate a set of vital ideals, not just democracy and capitalism, but also feminism, multiculturalism, human rights, egalitarianism, LGBTQ rights, and the dream of racial justice. These things are all intertwined in a progressive package that puts individual dignity at the center.
That is a hell of a to be sure paragraph.
What?
Yeah. To be sure, we've murdered and annihilated so many countries.
No, they compromised with tyrants. It's like, oh, we'd like you to be better, but geez, you're just holding all the cards. We're just the world's sole hegemon. We're just going to have to meet you halfway here, rather than that we're dictating the terms of what we want in these places to the degree we can.
It's another unfortunate oopsie. Oops, you know, took a bone saw to a reporter in the consulate in Istanbul. Oops.
Right.
Ask your dignity dealer about the progressive package.
Oh, yeah, it's interesting that he's trying to like frame it as progressive, which I think points to sort of this rehabilitation of neocons into the Democratic Party. That is, I think, unique. That's not the language they would have used 20 years ago. So that sort of shows that shift.
Well, yeah, in that paragraph, he says, look, oh, no, it's not just liberal democracy and capitalism. It's all these bonuses that go along with it, like feminism, multiculturalism, egalitarianism, and LGBTQ rights, which are the new justification for our ongoing cold and hot wars over the world. But I mean, this is doubly odd coming from David Brooks, because I mean, like, when did he decide that he was for gay and lesbian and trans rights?
Well,
was it 2 weeks ago?
When his audience shifted to, you know, MSNBC viewers as opposed to Fox News viewers.
I mean, but like David Brooks, specifically during the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration, wed himself entirely to a political project that explicitly sought to abrogate the rights of gay and lesbian people in this country.
Yeah, I mean, you can't imagine. I mean, you couldn't possibly imagine him justifying this conflict, 15 years ago. On the basis of what he writes in this paragraph. His audience the audience that he had at that time would read this and go, you know, what the hell are you talking about, dude? I don't want any of those things. Like, I don't agree with any of that.
Yeah, so I think it's trying to get back into like sort of the elite, urban, meritocratic, educated sphere. Like that is where it's a return home. That's where they started in their early 70s. They're Scoop Jackson Democrats, effectively. So they're returning back. I wouldn't be surprised if they start doing pro-labor positions soon as well, like Jackson did initially.
If the 21st century has taught us anything, it's that a lot of people, foreign and domestic, don't like that package and feel existentially threatened by it. China's leaders are not just autocrats. They think they are leading a civilization state and are willing to slaughter ethnic minorities. Vladimir Putin is not just a thug, he's a cultural reactionary. The Taliban champion a fantasy version of the Middle Ages. These people are not leading 20th century liberation movements against colonialism and American hegemony. They are leading a 21st century culture conf against women's rights, gay rights, minority rights, individual dignity, the whole progressive package.
Vladimir Putin needs to stop sagging his pants.
He's got to invest. He's got to buy into this dignity package that he keeps talking about.
Yeah, Vladimir Putin is walking around wearing huge UNC powder blue basketball shorts.
David Brooks aligning himself with pro-nationalist decolonization movements is fucking ridiculous. That is absurd.
He says, you know this is a culture war and not a traditional great power rivalry because the threat to each nation is more internal than external. The greatest threat to America is that domestic autocrats inspired by a global authoritarian movement will again take over the U.S. government. The greatest threat to China is that internal liberals inspired by global liberal ideas will threaten the regime. Each civilization is thus trying to attract believers to its own vision. It matters tremendously how we show up in the world. We're never going back to the Bush doctrine, but we're probably not going to do well in the battle for hearts and minds if we see ourselves abandoning our allies in places like Afghanistan. We're probably not going to do well if our own behavior begins to represent the real politic of autocrats. We probably won't do well if we can't look at ourselves in the mirror without a twinge of shame. David, How have you been looking at yourself at all these past 20, 30 years? How, like, what the fuck? Are there any mirrors in your house? I mean, it should have been Shiva at his fucking place for the last fucking for his entire career. I don't know how he passes by a fucking like a storefront window without catching a glimpse of himself and wanting to end it.
I think he looks at himself in the mirror like Patrick Bateman did.
I guess what befuddles me the most is the behavior of the American left. I get why Donald Trump and other American authoritarians would be ambivalent about America's role in the world. They were always suspicious of the progressive package that America helped promote. But every day I see progressives defending women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and racial justice at home, and yet championing a foreign policy that cedes power to the Taliban, Hamas, and other reactionary forces abroad. If we're going to fight Trumpian authoritarianism at home, we have to fight the more venomous brands of authoritarianism that thrive around the world. That means staying on the field.
I got to give credit to him because he is like Alexander Dugin is being the fucking I think you should leave guy right now. Like, oh my God, they admit it.
He admitted it.
Like he is saying that the neoliberal death empire is inextricably linked to ideas of cultural pluralism and racial and sexual egalitarianism, and that those two things are inextricably linked, and it's a package deal. If you want gay rights and trans rights, then you need drones and you need the IMF controlling your economy. You cannot detach those. You cannot unbundle them like it's a cable package.
Yeah, and I think this is not a pitch to the people that would actually have to fill out the personnel of the military, of the infantry. Like, that'll be something else. This is to the people who will, be their bosses, will be civilian officers at the CIA, people who program the shitty AI for drones, shit like that. But, they'll come up with something else for infantry because they're not going to get you to, put your body on the line with, we need to get Pashtuns to watch Schitt's Creek.
No, I mean, but they don't need to get anything for them. Economic coercion will do it for them.
Yeah.
But for people who you need to have a certain degree of expertise to do these jobs within the machinery, within the bureaucracy, you need to hire. It's just like with the woke CIA recruitment film. It's
exactly.
These people have to have gone to college, and the people who go to college have, by virtue of the fact that they're on that track already, have metabolized certain values. And this project is Brooks is just part of the broader project of creating a rationalization for these people as they pursue these careers that allow them to sleep at night.
And it's so ahistorical. I mean, to talk about the United States championing women's rights around the world. I mean, has he heard of the Helms Amendment? Has he heard of the global gag rule? Has he heard of any of the things the United States has consistently done for decades to damage women's healthcare and women's rights all over the world? It's just sort of amazing to see this kind of mythical presentation of U.S. foreign policy as the conduit for these progressive ideals.
Has he heard of it, David? He supported it until about 15 minutes ago. I mean,
exactly.
I guess the theme for today's episode is the neocons are all going back to their roots in the Democratic Party, and it seems to be a perfect fit. I mean, because it's not communism anymore, and it certainly isn't terrorism anymore because no one gives a shit. But now, they have the new excuse is the progressive dignity package that we have to engage in a global war in perpetuity for forever.
Because the Democratic Party is now fully the party of the international bourgeois, and the Republican Party is the party of the small national bourgeois who don't want to fucking have an empire. They think they can do domestic capitalism. They can't. They're idiots, but they think that, and they have complete institutional control at this point of the Republican Party.
All right. Well, I think that does it for David Brooks and this week's show. But before we go, Derek and Danny, would you tell the folks about American Prestige, how to listen, and what to expect?
Yeah, Danny, you want to take this one? You want to start?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'll take this one. So American Prestige is just the new foreign policy podcast by the two hottest foreign policy analysts working today. That's Derek and myself. You could find it on, anywhere you could get your podcast. And what we're really going to try to do is connect a lot of these issues that seem disconnected from what people go through in their lives to what's actually happening in the United States and present the global structure for what it is, which is a world order led and dominated and I would say perverted by a U.S. hegemony and the U.S. empire. So we plan to release episodes roughly every Friday, and we'd really appreciate any support that you could give us to build a sort of independent news source and commentary source about what's going on in the world and how many countries the U.S. is bombing this week.
Yeah, it's really, I think we want to marry, some context for the things that are happening in the world to the sort of bigger picture things that we talk about in terms of U.S. foreign policy and the impact that the United States has on these things. So it's going to be a mix of kind of international stories and, things that are more analytical in terms of America's role in the world and all the friends we've made along the way. And people can check us out, as Danny said, wherever you get your podcasts. There's a website, AmericanPrestigePod.com, that people can check out. I'll put in a plug for the newsletter too, for foreign exchanges, fx.substack.com, where I'm doing some of this stuff as well. So check those out, please.
I think maybe you missed it. I think you should have called the show the Oopsie Report.
That would have been good.
Cataloging all the oopsies of U.S. empire. Well, links to both the foreign exchanges and the new show will be in the episode description. But gentlemen, it was always a pleasure to talk world affairs with you guys. Derek Davison and Daniel Bessner, thanks so much.